So what I just did here was get a general sketch in, and I wanted to do something fairly interesting with the composition. This here is folds in the blanket, just a little bit of a direction. But if you were to break this canvas down in the middle, both up and down, we are basically avoiding the center of the canvas for our focal point. We want our focal point to be more to the off-center, which is more visually interesting. Having our block go off the page adds more interest. So even though, we are wanting to focus on color mostly, practicing good composition is important. Most important thing as a next step is to focus on color, temperature, and value. So we're going to be scanning the scene, and generally we have to start somewhere. So a good place to start is the lightest area, which would be the light that's coming from the window. So what we're looking at here is daylight coming. It's not hard, direct sun. It's a little softer than if we were outdoors with direct sun shining right on the sunlit side or the light side of the object. But we still see a pretty good contrast. When you squint your eyes, you really can see the contrast in things. So we want to keep our shapes when we're starting out pretty simple. But here we have, this could be broken down into several value turns, but we're going to keep that, again, really simple and make it pretty much just 3 shapes to describe this form going around. We really try to use different colors for each starting note, but the object is to really describe the light conditions that at the moment. So we normally start with the lighter light areas, sunlit areas, even though we don't have like a strong direct sun, but we've got, we want to describe some sort of warmth, but everything is relative. So a yellow can be cool and a red can be cool. It all depends on how you're using it. And they both also have warm properties. So we are, in this case, in the blue block, in the blue area, describing a sunlit or light hit area of the block. And so a warm cool would be a rose, permanent rose diluted with white to capture the value and the temperature of the light that is hitting that portion of the blue block. We then have our tabletop, which is also hit by pretty direct light. And even though from here to here it is a different, it goes kind of gradates to a little darker range because it gets farther away, we just treat it as one to start, and then you can go into the different value changes. And even though that cloth has some different colors in it, there's an underlying look or warmth that I see being a type of yellow. So I am going to go in with cad yellow with some white. Actually, don't want to have too much white mixed in because we do want there to be a pretty good value difference between the light hit area of the white vase and the tabletop. So this potentially could be a good starting note for the tabletop. But we don't want to fill in the areas completely. We want to just kind of put spots of color just to, for comparison. As this turns and as a white vase gets to be on the shaded side, typically it's going to have a more blue look to it. So keeping in mind the value degrees and the temperature factor, I'm going to go with a cobalt blue as a starting note for the shaded side of the vase. I'm not going to go too crazy again with filling in. I am also in the studio, so there is some reflected light, but we don't want to get distracted with that just yet. And we see under the vase in here it is much darker, which could be treated as a separate value and shade in itself. We could actually go back and put, kind of suggest that lemon yellow with some white in this area that's facing the same place that the edge of the vase is. As the vase turns, we've got like a warmer type of blue or warmer happening in here. So we might use a manganese blue, which has a warmth to it. It can be cool or warm, just like all the colors really can, depending on what it's depicting and what it's near. But this could be our middle range. And now we need to depict, like this has the yellow has a very small sliver of light hitting it. So that's something that we can put in after. And yellow ochre being somewhat of a muted, there tends to be a tad bit of a greenish look to a yellow in shade, and yellow ochre can be a good describing color. So I'm just going to put a little hint of it there because we want to make sure we've got a good start for our items, and both in the light and the dark. I'm seeing in this part that's hit by light, but it's at an angle that we could go actually with, it could be either an alizarin crimson or a permanent magenta with some white, because there's some warmth, but it's definitely got a coolness about it. It's not, you want to keep in mind, like when you squint, you kind of want to, the values are fairly close, and so that's something to consider even doing a color like this. You know, you might need to add a little more, whoops, got the wrong thing in there. Add a little more white. You can see how I just accidentally put cobalt violet in there and how much cooler that is. And that's not really what we want there. I'm going to try to scrape some of that off. So we are looking for a really strong contrast between this lit area of the vase and a very close value range to the tablecloth. And you want to try your best to achieve that in your starting notes. Then we've got cloth here that I feel it's now moving away from the light and could go now more with the cobalt violet to depict that. So even with this cobalt violet compared to the blue, it's a warmer color, but it is a cool color for this area of the cloth that is farther away from the warmth of the light. And, you know, there are different types of lights to consider. So when you're dealing with incandescent light, depending on the type of incandescent light, it could be a warm incandescent light, it could be you know, one of those daylight type lights. And so you want to factor in that information when you make your choices. Now this, compared to the table, shows up, it reads darker than the table. So I'd like to get in some of the table in there. So now we are comparing this starting note with what's happening with this edge of the vase and the cloth behind, and then eventually what's happening there. And this is why you don't want to get too committed with anything that you put down until you're sure that you've made good choices. Otherwise, it becomes more difficult to get the color off. And in the event that, you know, say you made the mistake of either painting the wrong color, and you've painted too much area, and the color that you need to put in a spot is polar opposite, or it's just going to make a mess, the best thing is to just get a fresh canvas and start over, because your start is key to a successful finish. So for the blue block. I am going to go right in with a ultramarine blue. Because this is warmer than what's happening over here. Now there will be some modifications as you put other layers down, but I am adding a little bit of white for this top layer, but still it's pretty dark. But what we have here is first notes that are just simply indicated to be sure that the right temperature, color, and value choices have been made. And everything is in comparison to what's next to it. So all colors have a warm and cool property. In the case of the light that's hitting the vase, it is not a hard direct sunlight, but it's still pretty bright. There's a coolness to it because it's a window light. The sun is not directly shining in, but we have a daylight. And so this is an atmospheric effect that we are dealing with at the moment. And so I'm indicating a starting note in each area that will then be developed into what's called the local color, the white vase, the blue block, the yellow block, and so on. And the subtle nuances will be added to this. But in order to have a proper foundation, we have to start with these bold colors and do a scan of the whole thing and compare each color that's next to the other. In the case of this composition, one of the things I wanted to point out was I not only set the composition up, but I designed it on the canvas so as not to have any one item smack dab in the middle. You want to break your canvas up into halves, both horizontally and vertically, and when you position your items, you want to have them overlapping some of the overlapping lines of the halves, but have things off center, and that creates some interest. The blue block is going off the canvas, and it just is a little more interesting design setup. And the cloth behind it adds some interest with its sweeping and changing, the sweep and lines of the cloth and the changing of the color notes, describing how the cloth is moving away from the light. At this point in time, I'm going to fill this all in because initially you just want to do color spots, because if you fill it in too soon and you discover that a color is wrong, then you've got to try to paint over or wait for it to dry or take the chance of creating mud in a particular area when you want to change the color. So it's better to not paint a whole area in, just do small color spots to be able to compare to the other color spots to make sure that you are on the right track with your color choices. So the cloth, I started with a yellow medium. The cloth behind on the left is a permanent magenta with some white in it. The light side of the vase is a lemon yellow or yellow light with white in it. The center value, while the vase turns, is a permanent manganese with some white. The shadow side of the white vase is a cobalt blue with a little bit of white. The blue block, I used ultramarine blue on the sides with no white in it and a little white on the top. The dark shadow that's under the lip of the vase, I used dioxide purple. There is a permanent rose that is the first note to indicate the light being hit on the blue block, because permanent rose is a cool warm. So we want to indicate some warmth there, but we wouldn't put a yellow, particularly because if you add the blue it's going to turn green, but you want to have a warmer note to indicate the light that's hitting that side of the blue block. The yellow block is mostly in shadow, and a good starting note that's warm but yet cool is the yellow ochre with pretty much no white mixed in. And then the cobalt violet on the cloth behind indicates the shadow areas as the cloth moves farther away from the light source. When you do the tabletop, using that yellow medium throughout is fine, because it's very subtle, the change as it moves away from the light, but you can make changes in the following notes that you put on top. So what I do, just a little tip on the palette knife, is I'll get a little bit of paint on the end. And you're working in, this is a 9x12, so it's fairly small. I like this palette knife, and I don't know, as you can see, the handle's all painted over, so I'm not exactly sure the number of this one, but it has a thinner, sharper point and blade, which gives me a little more control. So depending on how much space you're covering will determine how much paint you put on here, but because I'm kind of working in a small area, I get enough paint that I can spread around, and then I use the tip of the blade to push the paint around. And don't worry, it will take practice, because when I started with this, I was used to using a brush. And what has ended up happening since I learned to use and got comfortable with the palette knife is I love using it now. It's part of my creative expression and how I get some of the effects that I get that have inspired people to ask if I teach. The palette knife is one of the tools that has helped me achieve the look that I've gotten in the paintings that I've done more recently. Although I haven't done super tight detailed work with the palette knife, I have seen it done. I saw this beautiful landscape, still life I should say, that was done almost 100% with the palette knife. and it was incredible. So like everything else, you know, practice and time is involved. There's really no getting around it. There's no quick fix. But one thing I can say is with what I'm teaching you, I can save you some of that time.